Well, you know what time that is. That music means it's a very special time of day, and that is it's time for the latest edition of what I like to call IMNSHOW. In my not-so-humble opinion, where I get to share my point of view about just about anything I feel like talking about. Well, what's today's talking about? Well, it's actually another live edition recording session of the Nonfiction Brand podcast with a very special guest. And I want to introduce you to that very special guest in just a second. But I do want to say that the key thing to take away from this conversation today, I mean, there are going to be a ton of takeaways, believe me. But one of the big ones is podcasting is not just a good strategy for people who podcast themselves, host their own podcast, but it's a really great strategy for people who want to guest on podcasts. But perhaps what a lot of potential guests don't know, they don't know. Well, my guest today is here to tell us all about that. And I want to introduce you to him right now. In fact, I met Jason Cercone by being on his podcast, and we had a great conversation about the value of podcasting, kind of, just like everybody else, talking about how it's a great multiplier for personal brands who really want to get themselves out there. And when we started talking, I was kind of talking from as a host of a podcast, it's a great way for me to get my personal brand out there. But as we talked, it became pretty apparent to me that what you were or the point of view you were coming from was, yeah, but it's a really tremendous way for people who may not have the time, talent, or ability to podcast. That doesn't mean you can't be on podcasts if you have the right strategy. And that's why I'm so happy to be talking to Jason Cercone today, because he is actually the dude to talk to if you want to know how to put podcasting in your personal brand embellishment, leveraging strategy, even if you don't have a podcast. Am I telling the truth about kind of who you are, what you do, and how you do it, Jason?
Yeah, that's pretty accurate, DP. I mean, it is one of the common misconceptions with the podcasting space is that you have to have a show to maximize your time. And I'm here to tell you today that is not the case. And I think one of the more disturbing statistics that surrounds podcasts, and I'll tell you, I actually just looked this up last night from the day that we're recording. It is something like 4.5 million registered podcasts right now, which is, that number blew my mind because the last I had heard it was just a little over 2.5. So I only referenced one article, don't know how true that is, but the more disturbing part of that statistic was that like a fraction of that, something around like 1 million and change, were still producing their own shows. They're still producing new shows and new content. And the industry term for that is pod fading, meaning the podcast launched and then it faded away. And I think that one of the big reasons for that is that people start podcasts not really knowing and understanding how much work is involved with building a podcast. And DP, you can testify as much as I can. We are both podcasters. We know how much work goes into this. So for people that want to be a part of this world and be a part of podcasting, you don't have to have your own show to be effective. People like me, people like you, we're always looking to have interesting conversations, thoughtful conversations, and have that impact the audience that is listening to our show. In order to do that, we have to have great guests. So as a personal brand, as any type of personality that's looking to enhance your message, get it out to a wider audience, bring new people into your circle of influence, doing it via podcast guest marketing is the way to go, because podcasts are incredibly popular. Before I finish this sentence, a new podcast will launch. There's so much going on in this space, and it's great to be a part of. But if you don't have the bandwidth in your day to produce a show, be a guest and make an impact that way.
Yeah, and I want to go back and underline that figure you came out with right up at the top. 5 million podcasts, plus or minus.
Right.
When I wrote my book, Nonfiction Brand, I actually looked it up, and that was about a year and a half ago, and it was under 1 million. And then I looked it up again, maybe about 4 months ago, and it was 2.5 million. So the space is exploding hugely, as everyone knows, and especially if you like podcasts yourself, you know the value that podcasts bring. But what a lot of people, especially those newbies who are arriving in the podcast space, you alluded to it, it takes time. I don't know about you and your podcast, but if you aggregate every episode's time when it comes to scheduling and editing and posting and following up and making sure you've got a certain amount of marketing going on social media, even if you're not paying for any of that stuff, it still takes time. I mean, I did the calculation for myself, and I'm going to say right around 10 hours a week for a weekly podcast. Mm-hmm. Now, if you're working a 40-hour job, that's 25% of your job on top of the full-time job I already have. So if you do the math, I think there are a lot of people out there who'd like the benefit of podcasting without the, as you say, the kind of pain and maintenance of having a regular podcast. And again, that leads back right to you and your strategies about being a podcast guest. Now, when I started my podcast, I'll be honest with everybody out there, I was very, very picky about who I had on, because who I have on my podcast reflects directly on me and my abilities as a curator to bring smart people who have great things to share and say on my podcast. But it frankly became harder and harder because I'll be honest with you, I don't know that many people. I'm on podcast number, this will probably go out in the 180s, so I don't know 180 people. And even though my podcast comes out twice a week, so you divide that by 2 and you get a more reasonable number, 90, I don't even know 90 people that are really that smart, that bring stuff to the table. So all of a sudden, I'm having a little problem getting the quality of guest I wanted after I went through people. And, if you listen to this podcast, I'm not afraid to repeat people. If they're really great people on, like Jay Baer and Mark Schaefer, I'm having them on probably once every 6 months or maybe even a year or something like that. But at the same time, I want to bring new people to the fore. I want to bring people like you in front of my audience so they can learn something new. And when I met you on your podcast, I'm like, dude, I got to have you on. But I'll be honest with you, the way that we got to know each other was through, call it an online pod brokering service, if you will.
Podcasting Tinder, if you will.
Well, exactly. I swipe right on someone who you're matched with on a service called Podmatch. Now, I'm not a endorser or they don't pay me, but I get a ton of value out of Podmatch. So I'm not afraid to direct people out to podmatch.com all day long, whether you're a podcaster or a guest. But there are other services out there. But the point I want to make is Podmatch, and this is the cool thing. You list what you're interested in, what you talk about, what you're expert in, and they find people who are looking for people who share a great amount of commonality. I think you and I matched at just under 70%.
Right.
And consequently, that caught my attention, and that evidently caught your attention too. Because that's how we connected. And I'm super, super glad to have met you, because everything that you say about the guest podcasting strategy that you've developed over time, I'm like, hallelujah. If I get more guests who do what you tell them to, I'm going to have an even better podcast. So I want to start by making it clear that you have something to offer people specifically if they go to your website. And why don't you tell us about that guide that you have developed?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you hit a very important point there, DP. It's the fact that, this isn't just turn on a microphone, open your mouth, say some words, and at the end of the day, it all falls into place. There's a strategy to it, just like anything else. Excuse me. And what I was discovering is that people were going at it with more of a haphazard approach, and they may have a great microphone voice and they may be very good at projecting themselves and telling their story to some degree. But in the long and short of it, what I was discovering was I felt like what I could do is take some of the experiences that I've had, both from hosting podcasts, from producing podcasts, and being a guest on podcasts, and teach others how to be the best possible podcast guest. And the result in that is that they'll win because they will be able to impact the audience they're speaking to. And if they have a strong call to action, that audience can then connect with them, learn more about what they do, and potentially become a customer. And even if they don't become a customer right away, they're now in the circle of influence. They can learn from you because you made an impact on them and provided value. At the same time, you're helping podcasters make better content. That's going to help them grow. That's going to help their show find more people. And it's just this very beautiful circle that keeps completing itself over and over, because the more people are optimized to be a good podcast guest, the more impact they can make, the better the content is for each show they appear on. And then that show can then in turn use that content to attract more listeners, because it's good content that people want to listen to and really learn from. So I developed a podcast optimization guide that really addresses all of the items that you should be paying attention to as you get into podcast guest marketing. So it's sort of a boot camp, so to speak, but this guide is incredibly easy to read. I tried to add some entertainment to it as well, and it's gone through a few drafts and revisions ever since I handed it out to some people to check out just to get their feedback. But it ultimately has landed in a way that as you absorb this information, you can, with confidence, start looking for the right podcast to be on. And if you want to use a service like Podmatch, it's incredibly valuable. You can get connected with a lot of people that are doing very similar things to you. So you know that your mission and your message aligns with their content, which is one of the big factors that we talk about in the very beginning of the optimization guide. There's also many agencies out there that are always looking to help people get booked on the right podcasts. So if you're in a position where you're fully prepared, you understand what the expectations are, you're not going into this thinking, all right, podcast guest marketing, I'm just going to go on Joe Rogan's show and knock it out of the park and win. If you can get over that real quick and start realizing that there's more value in the smaller audience, riches in the niches, as our friend Pat Flynn would say. And I know I've heard you reference that on your show before, DP.
Oh, yeah. Big fan of his.
Yeah, it's incredibly true, though. You can make more of an impact on a smaller, defined audience than you can going on a show that has this global reach, but it's very broad. It's not geared towards your mission and your message. So the optimization guide walks you through from start to finish. Here's what you need to know. Here's how you set up your goals. You build your plan of action. Here's how you start looking for the right podcasts, and these are things you should be looking for. Here's how you actually present yourself to that podcast versus just sending an email saying, hey, I'm really cool, you booked me on your show. There's a method to the madness from start to finish. And that's really where I put my eggs in this basket. I want to make sure that as podcasting continues to grow, the guests that are coming in to help podcasters make their content are fully optimized and ready to rock and roll when they turn on that microphone.
Well, and I think that's brilliant, because there's podcasting is still a little bit Wild Westy when it comes to stuff. There are people trying all sorts of different things, and from the very beginning of my podcast, it's been unspoken, but everyone understood. I don't charge you anything to be on my podcast, and you don't charge me anything to be a guest on my podcast, because it's a win-win. It's a mutual beneficial relationship. The funny thing is, I was just matched with somebody, and it looked like their podcast was like perfect for me to be on as a guest. And my value to them is that typically if we get along well, and just about every time we do, I invite them on my podcast. There's kind of a quid pro quo understanding. Well, so they wanted me to fill out a form, which is not unusual. I don't make anyone fill out any form other than answer a couple of questions so I can have some stuff for my episode notes, like where people can follow you on Twitter, stuff like that. And that's all beneficial to you. So taking 2 seconds to fill that out shouldn't be a big part of your day. So I fill out this thing, and then down at the bottom is a thing that says, if you miss the recording session once it's scheduled, you will be billed $25 for a missed session. And I'm like, I have never seen that before. I certainly have never asked for that before. That's, to me, crazy, but what the heck? I'm not going to miss the session, so I'll go ahead and do that. I fill it out, and bing, 2 minutes later, in my email box is an invoice for $25. I'm like, we haven't even scheduled anything yet, and you're hitting me up for money? That is bogus. And so I have to ask you, because you're very experienced in the podcast space, can you talk about these issues about pay for play? Because there are pay for play podcasts. Mine isn't, yours isn't, but what should people expect if they want to become a guest? Is the first thing they do is get out a checkbook?
It's becoming more of a commonality. I mean, I know paywalls are becoming more of a thing. I mean, a lot more podcasts are asking for Patreon donations, things like that. I have seen some more quote unquote well-known shows. I mean, I don't think everyone is dropping the true size of their audience, and download numbers to me are a flawed vanity metric, so I don't even want to bring that into the discussion. But I think it really depends on what they're using their podcast for. And in many cases, a lot of them are using it as a marketing tool, but they're going to use it as a way to generate content. Whether you feel the content of that show is something you want to pay for, look at it as a marketing investment if you're going to pay. In your case, DP, that is incredibly ballsy to say, if you miss the recording session, then you'll get billed $25. I have seen things like that. And I've seen it not so much with podcast interviews. I've seen it more with consultations, where if you have booked a consultation, then you don't show up and then say, oh, I missed it, I'm sorry, I want to reschedule. Then they'll say, okay, it's $25 to come on and talk with me now. That I get to a degree. I've never seen it with podcasting, but then to bill you anyway.
Yeah. To bill me in advance.
That is not, I mean, if I'm hearing you correctly, that's not what it said.
It wasn't.
So that is, to me, that is creating horrible upfront relationship building. I mean, it's a complete mess. I would never feel, I'd almost feel like this is nothing more than a transaction to this person. We're not going to have a genuine conversation. They just want my money, even and $25 at that. That seems incredibly petty.
Well, and I was so kind of cheesed off by that I contacted them via the Podmatch, messaging system, and I was very calm about it. But I just said, in my 5 years of podcasting, I have never once been charged in advance for anything. In fact, I've never been charged for any guest spot on someone's show. I've never charged on my show. So this is incredibly off-putting. And the person came back and was calm and said, well, you know how when you go to a doctor and you miss an appointment, they'll charge you. And I just wanted to scream back and say, you're not a doctor.
You haven't missed the appointment yet. You haven't had
exactly. It. Give me a break. So I bring this up, and I wanted to have this conversation just because it hit me the wrong way. And I wanted to get your perspective, because you're in a different part of the pod universe. And yeah, I know there are some pods that are charged pay for play. A lot of them have to do with authors. You got a new book, you pay to be on this thing where you've got a lot of people listening to find out about new books. Okay, I understand that. But that was not what we were talking about. I was talking about providing you a platform in my podcast to help boost your personal brand. And the quid pro quo was that you would provide me potentially a spot on your podcast to do the same thing. And by the way, if you decided after we had our podcast conversation that I wasn't right for your show, I'd be, okay, no harm, no foul, not a problem. thanks a lot. Good luck with your podcast.
I think it's more of a standard now to have a 15-minute discovery call before an actual interview takes place. In that call, you can determine if this person is a good fit for your show. I've done those myself. I've been a part of those as the oncoming guest. So it makes more sense to do that versus immediately thinking that someone is going to respond positively to a charge to be on that show. And at the end of the day, I think it comes down to, again, the value that you're going to get from being on that show. Do they have an audience that's going to bring you hundreds of leads and expand your network and give you plenty of opportunities to grow and make money from that audience? If that's the case, $25 is a drop in the bucket. But it's more to me, I mean, again, one of the big things I stress, and this isn't just with the podcast guest optimization, this is just everything I do, it's communication. If you're not communicating effectively, then you're not going to win. And podcasting is all about effective communication. And I've talked to people I just wonder how they've gotten as far as they have.
Yeah, I know
whatsoever.
Yeah, I know exactly, because after this interaction, I'm like, not only will I not pay your $25, I don't want to be on your podcast. And if I run across anyone who's ever mentioned your name, I won't speak poorly about you. I'll just tell the truth about what you did and allow them to decide whether, are you kidding me? Because the fact is, everything you do in life says something about you as a brand. It literally goes into your brand suitcase. And you can have the most beautiful brand handle or brandle in the world that describes you as a whatever you are that is so attractive to other people. But your suitcase has all those other things in there. Things like, yeah, I charge people to be on my podcast. And when they question the charge, I then say, oh, if you need it waived, I'll waive it for you. And I'm like, you're implying that I need it waived as opposed to that it's inappropriate for you to even ask for this? Am I insane here?
Yeah,
and I guess I want to underline that for listeners, which is, if you choose to make guesting on podcasts part of your personal brand building strategy, understand asking for money to be on a podcast is very rare. And when I say that, I'll bring up one of the guests I've had on recently, a young man from Singapore named Rayson Chu, who got Gary Vaynerchuk on his podcast, even though he's a young guy in Singapore. Do you think Gary Vaynerchuk asked for money to be on the podcast, or that Rayson Chu asked him to pay to be on his podcast? No. But here's the thing, Gary Vaynerchuk got to be Gary Vaynerchuk by saying yes, even to small podcasters all the way on the other side of the world. And I know why he did it, because Gary Vaynerchuk probably said, you know what? I don't know how big my audience is in Singapore. If this guy can help me get more interest in Singapore is the financial hub of Southeast Asia. If I can get over there and start meeting more people in Southeast Asia, you can see the strategy at play, which is, if Rayson knows 50 key people in Singapore, he's worth more to me than someone who has 50,000 Americans. Why? Because 50,000 Americans already have heard of me or can find out about me very easily. But if you met 50 key people in Singapore, that's where it goes back to what you were saying earlier about having small audiences be perhaps even more effective for you, because they are so tight, because they are so connected, and they are so personally interactive. If you're one of 5 million, you're basically nobody to nobody. If you're one with 50 and all 50 like you write your own ticket over time, But anyway, bottom line, podcast, you want to be a guest, don't pay and don't ask to be paid.
Yeah, I would say, the only time that I would pay is if they were upfront about how and why, and B, I felt like it was a meaningful investment that was going to help me. If my appearance was going to go, I mean, I know Entrepreneurs on Fire
Yeah.
is a $35 appearance fee. That show has 500,000 downloads a month.
Yeah.
So if you look at that and say, okay, this audience is going to resonate with my message, it makes sense for me to make this investment. Then by all means, make that investment. But if it's something that's ticky-tack like that, like $25 coming at you that you didn't even expect, that's a totally different story. And that to me is more of a communication issue than it is a ridiculous fee issue, although it is a ridiculous fee.
Well, it left a bad taste in my mouth, and consequently, that personal brand is dead to me.
There you go.
But I will tell you, this personal brand is certainly not, because Jason and I had a great talk on his Evolution of Brand podcast, which I don't know if it's come out yet, but if it hasn't, check it out. Check out Evolution of Brand, because you'll get a lot more Jason goodness on it. And also search for the episode where Jason and I talk, because I really enjoyed it. And I think that the listeners of the Nonfiction Brand podcast will get a lot out of it. But Evolution of Brand is not the only pod thing you've got going. What else do you have going on in the podcasting space? Let me say that again. What else do you have going on in the podcasting space?
Evolution of Brand is my podcast that allows me to have just absolute tremendous conversations with professionals and entrepreneurs from all over the globe. And that's been my favorite aspect. And it's funny how things escalate as you get rolling. When I first started, I mean, I took a year to really plan out what I wanted this show to be. And when it finally started coming to fruition to where everything was in place, I had identified my ideal listener. I had built all the graphics. I knew the format. I knew what I wanted to do. And I started reaching out to get guests on. I started meeting new people. I started meeting people that then introduced me to other new people. And it's just been a wild ride. And the conversations that I've got to have, for me personally, that is enough to keep the podcast going. And I know that many people get into a funk with their podcast because they just don't see the numbers they were expecting. And, oh, I don't have enough downloads and no one's listening to this. And why is this just so bad? And I'm putting so much time into this. And that's where, from a guesting perspective, from a producing perspective, you have to go back to square one and you have to define why you're doing this from the start. If you don't have a mission in mind with your podcast or even with your guesting efforts, you're going to fail. Your podcast as a podcaster will go away because you will eventually keep deprioritizing it to a point to where it becomes nothing but a sunken rock in the ocean. And that's why there's so many podcasts out there. And that's where I say, if you start a podcast, you need to start something that you're passionate about, that you can talk about when no one's listening. If you were sitting in a room by yourself, you could still talk about it and you'd still have fun doing it. Because the reality is, in the beginning, that's how it is. You have to build your audience. Yeah. And that was how, and I was able to get to that point through 6 years of podcasting experience, through other shows that I'd attempted that I did lose my passion for. So I moved away. And that's when I started, I took these lessons and I threw it all and made this amalgam with Evolution of Brand. This is what I want. This is what I know. And this is how I want to do it. And it's been, I haven't regretted a second of it. And that's my big recommendation to podcasters out there. When you're starting a show, make sure it's a topic that you can remain passionate about and value the conversations you're having over everything else. You just created a platform where someone else who shares your interests and shares your passions is agreeing to come on with you and talk about them for half an hour, for 45 minutes, for 1 hour, whatever. That's awesome. You get to talk about your passion for an hour and then put it into a format that goes globally. And it may not get discovered by the globe today, but it could get discovered by the globe next week, next month, next year. That's the beauty of evergreen content. Think of podcasting in that perspective, and you're going to be a lot more successful. So your original question, DP, I feel like I've ventured off the path, but Evolution of Brand was built in that framework, and that's how I continue to roll out new episodes every Tuesday. And then I do a recap episode every Friday where I'll add in a little tip or strategy or whatever. It's like, I think I've had a couple Black Friday rants about why I hate Black Friday and things like that in the past. I mean, there's been all kinds of different things I talk about. And then I'll give a sneak preview of the next episode too. So every week I've got 2 episodes coming out. The conversation episode on Tuesday is always a little bit longer. The recap's usually anywhere from 10 to 20 minutes. And that is my way of connecting and networking and meeting new people and having great conversations. And that's stemmed into what I'm doing with podcast guest marketing and the whole optimization angle that I've put on this. I realized that as I got into the world and started helping people get booked on podcasts, I started seeing how that side of things worked. I met a lot of people that are in that space. And what I realized was there's a lot of agencies that are helping people do this. I'm glad to be a part of it, but I want to do more. I want to help them understand this platform a little bit more. And that was where I looked at, okay, what can we do to make podcasts as a whole better? Hosts obviously need to focus on sound quality, focus on their overall production, focus on asking good questions and having meaningful conversations. The guests can come in and play a huge role in that. They just need to understand why and understand how and understand what they can accomplish from that. So I felt that providing that value is much more impactful than just being someone that helps them get booked on podcasts. Because as we know, we've talked about Podmatch as we've talked today, DP. Incredible service. And there's a lot of services out there like that. I feel I'm a big fan of Podmatch. That's one I'm personally involved with. But I know there's a lot of agencies out there helping too. And my goal is to help them have an easier job, because if people can come to them with a better understanding of what they want to accomplish, that's going to help them find the right shows for them. And then it goes back to the beginning. Everybody wins because the content is better, because everybody's more prepared and has a better understanding of what they can achieve.
Yeah, well, that's all great. And, the stuff you share is so wonderful. I understand that you've got well, number one, we're coming to the end of this week's episode, but don't worry, Jason's going to be back with me again next week. But before we go, Jason, I understand that you have a guide that's available for people to download that can get them started. I hate to use the word journey because everybody does, but to get them started developing a podcast guest strategy that can work for them. Where can listeners of the Nonfiction Brand podcast go to get that guide?
I put together a blueprint for podcast guest optimization that walks you through all of the steps to understanding what to expect from the network, all the way up through getting booked and how to analyze your interviews and get results from those interviews. So the best place to visit is jasoncercone.com/nonfictionbrand. And when you go there, you can connect with me on social media, but you can also get access to my free guide, which is called Guest Theory: 10 Tips for Becoming a Valuable, Fully Optimized Podcast Guest. So check out that page and you will get everything you need in regards to understanding what podcast optimization is, or I should say podcast guest optimization is, and how you can develop a winning podcast guest marketing campaign.
Oh man, you got to go, people. You got to go to jasoncercone.com/nonfictionbrand. Ooh, I love that vanity URL because it's definitely worth it. And by the way, I've actually taken a look at the guide, and it is packed with information, practical information. I won't call it theoretical information, but when I say practical, I mean what type of microphone would be right, or what type of technology do I need to have? Can I do this from various platforms ranging from a smartphone to how much of a studio setup do I need to have? And the answers will frankly surprise you, because especially with smartphones these days, the sound quality can be pretty darn good. But anyway, the guide looks at all that stuff. And again, you can find that at jasoncercone.com/nonfictionbrand. Circone is spelled Cercone. As someone who very carefully spells his last name every single day, I appreciate people, especially on podcasts, who spell out last names like Circone. Anyway, Jason, thank you so much for being on this episode of the Nonfiction Brand podcast. We'll be back together again next week, but before people leave, I would love for you to like, subscribe, refer this podcast to others, and review it, because that really helps other people find it. Until next week, I'm DP Knudten, your host, and he is
Jason Cercone.
And we'll be talking at you again next week. Bye-bye. Pause. So, Jason, what got you into podcasting in the first place? Were you a podcast fan before you were a podcast host?
Yeah, I went to school back, I'm dating myself, when I went to college back in the late 90s, early 2000s. I was a communications major. Radio was always what I gravitated to. I had a radio show that was a blast, where I probably got away with some things that I would never get away with on a traditional radio station, but that's a story for another day. And I'd always loved it, but I never got into it as a profession. I found out when I moved from the small town of Bradford, Pennsylvania, where I went to college and where I grew up, to Pittsburgh after school, that it was a little difficult to get right into it without interning. And because I needed to pay for things and have a place to live, it really didn't work out in my favor. So over the years, I got into different things in regards to my career path. And I had met a gentleman who did what I learned that night was a podcast. And when he told me what, I'm like, well, what? Tell me about what this is. And he said, oh, it's like radio for the internet. It's like, interesting. Okay, that sounds good. And that made me do a little bit more digging and searching. And my best friend and I had kicked around starting a podcast once we got more familiar and we were seeing what this medium was all about. And it was starting to become more popular. You were seeing more podcasts pop up. And we could never land on anything that we really wanted to do. And at that point, I was running a craft beer blog, and I was launching a service that was going to help promote events and news and things happening within the beer drinking community here in Pittsburgh. And as I was launching that, right before, I think it was the day I made the site live, I had a guy jump on Twitter and just start trolling me about how this was never going to work and this was never going to be a good thing. And I don't know, how do you think you can do this, blah, blah, blah. And it got me wondering what this guy did. And I said, he has a podcast about beer. I can do that, and I can do it better. Texted my buddy. He said, this is what we're going to do. This is going to be our podcast. We're going to do a podcast about beer. That was it. That was like the extent of our planning. And the results showed that, because the show sucked. Looking back on it, I mean, from an experience standpoint, it was great because it got me into podcasting. It helped me learn some things that I obviously needed to develop and get better at, but it helped me rekindle that fire for radio and for audio that I had back in college. And then one thing led to another, and it's brought me to where I am today, where I'm working in the industry full time. So it's great how everything has panned out. It just took a minute to get there, but that's what brought me in. It's a funny story. I always tell people, don't start a podcast out of spite, because I feel like that's what I did. But like I said, in the long and short of it, it was very, very good experience. We got to meet some really cool people, have some awesome conversations. And like I said, it was good foundation for where I'm at today.
You know, Jason, I love that story, because one of my daughters is right now in college, a DJ at the local college station. And talk about not having an audience or not knowing if anyone's listening. She doesn't, but she doesn't care, because it's a form of expression. She gets to choose the music she wants to play. She gets to talk about the bands she wants to feature. She even has a platform to invite local bands to come on the station and play live, which is so super cool. I mean, she's a junior in college who basically is a music maven for Minneapolis, because she's on the air, and nobody has to know that her audience may not exist or it might be small. She doesn't even care. And the fact that you came out of that kind of background as well is wonderful. But the thing I really want to point to is you called it you said don't start a podcast out of spite. I didn't get that out of your story. What I got was, if he can do that, I can do it too. So what's stopping me? And That is the whole point. If you think it's hard, think again. Now, I'm not going to say it's easy, but it's not hard. There was a time when you could not do anything a podcast does without a 50,000 watt radio station behind you. But now the democratization of audio and video, if you want to look at it that way, but I'm talking specifically about audio in the podcast space, anybody can have their own radio station about whatever you want via a podcast. And that's what I love about it, because let's face it, how many people are actively thinking, I need to find a resource about nonfiction branding? It's a concept they don't know anything about. Why? Because I made it up. Or they might be thinking, well, I need to build my personal brand. Well, again, not a lot of people are thinking about that, but maybe they should be. So this is my opportunity to find my niche or my niche, depending on how you like to pronounce it, the same way you're doing it with the podcast guest optimization kind of empire you're beginning to build, about helping people discover how podcasts can work for them, even if they don't have a podcast. And I think that's brilliant. We talked about it last week. We'll talk about it even more this week. But I want to just point out again, you decided you could do it because someone who was giving you a ration of crap was doing it. So you wanted to do it better than they did. That is perfectly fine motivation. Let me tell you, what is it? Imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. Yeah, to a certain extent, to a certain extent. But in reality, being better than they did it because they cheesed you off a little bit, that's the sincerest form of take that, you son of a fill in the blank. So anyway, so you went from there, you developed the podcast. Are you still doing the beer podcast?
No, that actually, what ended up happening there was I did beer podcast, and my best friend and I life started taking over, schedules weren't driving, and then I did the show by myself for a while with other people as guests, and then when I decided, okay, I think I'm going to retire that and rebrand it to what my blog was called, so I did that, and then ran with that for a little bit. And then after I did that show for, I can't remember how many episodes I got to. That was when I decided, and this I feel like this was the most critical step. I don't think you have this, but this is just what I chose to do. As I was doing that podcast, I really started evaluating the whole podcasting space and what I wanted to make of it and get from it, and realized that the value that I was providing just wasn't as good as it could be. I needed to get better at my craft. And obviously continuing to do interviews helps with that. And you can develop your voice and really just get better on the fly. But I felt like I had enough of that under my belt that I really wanted to just take some time away, not worry about the production side, just study what other people were doing in regards to relaying their message through their voice. So I canceled that podcast, took it down, and took about a year and a half of just listening to other podcasts, listening to radio shows, listening to personalities deliver the news, broadcast sports. So I was watching all of these things for an entirely different reason than I ever had before. I got very analytical, and it helped me discover, okay, there's pace, there's tempo, there's things that I should be focusing on when I'm doing an interview, and laying back and letting somebody get their point across. Don't try to interrupt and interject something, and focus more on having a valuable conversation versus trying to interrupt with a point that I feel is so poignant, I have to get it out before I forget it. So all of these things went into my mind. I call it like a little short end associate's degree of podcasting, where I just took time to study, took time to learn, and then I got back into it, launched a new show, and that show was much more successful. So I had that more on the beer side of marketing, beer side of sales. Just I was trying to create a podcast that was more for the business side versus just the craft beer drinker, because there are a lot of podcasts dedicated to that. So I wanted to do something a little different. And over time, I guess I can attribute it to age. As I got older, that passion that I once had for beer and for drinking and partying and just being a fun loving guy, I got more serious about things, and I just didn't have that same passion So I shifted gears and I took it more towards the personal branding and marketing side of things, and started focusing more on the platform as a whole. Because as I looked at my development and my timeline through that whole process, podcasting was the constant. I changed a few things here and there in regards to approach, but podcasting was the constant. I knew this was the industry I wanted to be a part of. So it was determining how. So I actually did launch another podcast that was dedicated to delivering tips and strategies about podcasting. So it was a podcast for podcasters, and that show's still out there. And I just did release a second season of that show a couple months back, but there's probably not going to be plans to do anything further because my focus now is on evolution of brand. And I'm loving how that show's going, and I want to keep building on those results.
Well, there you go. I mean, I love the fact that you went to school on podcasting and audio and hosting and interviewing by listening to the best in the wherever they happen to be. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't do, or maybe don't do enough of. One of the things that I'm sure you advise your advisees, and I certainly do myself, is before you start building a podcast or producing a podcast, listen to a ton of them and find a handful that are the ones that you constantly enjoy and figure out why you enjoy them. Like one of my favorite podcasts is Daring Fireball's John Gruber's podcast called The Talk Show. And it has no music at the front. It has no intro at the front. He doesn't introduce himself or his guest or anything like that. I've talked about that podcast on this podcast a couple of times because I'm just impressed by his respect for the intelligence of his audience. And that's what I take away from his podcast. He respects the intelligence of his audience. Another podcast I really love is the Pivot podcast with Kara Swisher and Scott Galloway, which focuses on tech and media and stuff like that. And it's their banter back and forth. And while you can tell they've got a framework for the show, like they have sections where they know they're going to talk about this general topic, they have no scripts. I mean, they have some scripted advertisements in the middle of it. But for the most part, it's just pure conversation, and they're laughing at each other. And, you know, it's just so purely human. That's what I took from that. So my goal is to have a podcast that truly respects the intelligence of my audience and allows for conversations with people like you, Jason, that are yes, we agree on the importance of some stuff, but you're coming at stuff from a different point of view. And if you took issue with something I said, I would be thrilled because then I know I'd be learning something. You know,
Yeah.
I hate those Amen Corner podcasts where everyone is in agreement all the time. I love it when someone says, well, you know, I kind of take issue with that. Oh, good. Tell me why. So, Jason, take issue with something I've just said and tell me why.
I wish I could. No, but I can piggyback on what you just said, and with 100% confidence, and say controversy creates cash. Controversy creates listenership. More people are going to be sucked into something that could turn into a little bit more heated argument. It's the staring at an accident type of mentality. We love that type of thing in our world, but at the same time, I think it opens up the windows for more learning to take place. Because if I just went with what you just said and said, oh yeah, I agree with everything you say, that's a terrible conversation, and there's only one point of view. But if I can come back and add to what you just said with what I'm saying now, and then add on top of that, what I love about your show, DP, one of the things I love about your show, you get right to the value. You get right to the conversation. That's what I do on my show as well. And that was as I was putting, like I said before, I think I said this last week, I put a year's worth of time into building what I wanted Evolution of Brand to be. And I listened to a lot of different podcasts for the best elements of those shows. And the one that really tipped me off on getting to the value as fast as possible was Entrepreneurs on Fire with John Lee Dumas. It's about a 30-second to 1-minute intro that just sets a table for what you're going to learn, for who the guest is, And then he does a quick sponsor ad and he's right into the content within about a minute. And I started thinking, I'm like, my gosh, back in the day, I would do this 30-second to 1 minute intro song that every week was the same. So if I had an avid listener, they had to sit and listen to that if they didn't press fast forward. And then I do this opening monologue that could be anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes. And it was, you're 12 minutes deep before you're getting to the actual reason that people showed up for the show. And that was to hear the conversation. So I started thinking that the value is not in this beginning intro part. The value is let's get people to the meat and potatoes of this interview as fast as possible and not fill the show up with a lot of fluff. I know one of the big misconceptions in the space is that podcasts have to be a certain length. Why?
Yeah.
Everywhere else in the world, we're trying to shorten things. We have an example that we talked about on one of the episodes of Pod Theory, me and Travis Brown, who's a good buddy of mine, and we did a whole season about misconceptions of podcasting. And we talked about, okay, if you have a clogged toilet and you go to YouTube to find out how you can unclog that toilet, and your search query delivers back a 3-minute video, a 6-minute video, and a 9-minute video, which one are you going to watch?
Shortest one possible.
You're going to watch the 3-minute video because it's the shortest one possible. So our mentality there is, okay, how can I get this? How can I get the value that I'm looking for as fast as possible? But when I'm making a podcast, I've got to make it an hour long. No, not at all. Make it as long as it needs to be to get the value out there, to get the message out there. And if you can cut out some of the BS, which would be a lengthy intro or a huge monologue or a huge ending outro, like there's all kinds of things you can do to save time, but give people the value. Give it to them as fast as possible, and that's going to keep them engaged with your content. And that's where I feel that if we're going to keep getting better as podcasters, those are the elements we have to start looking at. So again, taking that time to study, evaluate what others are doing. What can you emulate? I'm not saying rip people off or copy them verbatim, but you can learn so much from just listening to the good shows that have made an impact on the world. And then in turn, as people discover you, your show will make an impact as well.
Well, and because so much of our conversation has been about your podcast guest optimization strategies, we got to definitely encourage listeners to do that as well, which is listen to the best guests and determine what makes them the best guests. I mean, seriously, there are people who are on podcasts all the time. Why? Because the hosts know that these guests are going to be spot on, just interesting to listen to every single time. Everyone knows Brene Brown, right? The power of authenticity and vulnerability and all that stuff. That topic would be dismal if she wasn't this personable, likable, beautiful person inside and out who is up there being so dang real. Now, I actually went and looked up her very first TEDx talk, not TED Talk. It was TEDx. And in my book, NONFICTION BRAND, I refer to TEDx as the kids' table of TED, which it is. And it was TEDx Houston. So it was a bigger TEDx. It wasn't TEDx Stevens Point, which we have here in Wisconsin, but it's still small, right? She gets up there and gives the most compelling talk about shame because she was a researcher about shame to determine why we feel shame, what shame is, all this stuff. And I'm like, why am I watching this woman talk about shame? And the answer is because she's compelling to watch, to learn from, to get her sharing. So yeah, I'll spend whatever amount of time to listen to her talk about shame because she's got great skills as a communicator. And that's the key. To be a great podcast guest, you've got to be a communicator. To be a great 100%. Podcast host, you've got to be a communicator. And when you get those 2 + 2 together, you get 15, and that's what I love about this. Again, I want listeners to be able to get your podcast guest optimization strategy book. How can they get that? Where do they have to go to grab some of your Jason Cercone goodness?
Head over to jasoncercone.com/nonfiction brand, and you'll be able to get access to 10 tips for becoming a valuable, fully optimized podcast guest. That is my free gift to all the great listeners of Nonfiction Brand. And you can also connect with me on your favorite social network from that page as well. But yeah, I mean, to piggyback on what you said in regards to communication, that's paramount. That is the number one aspect. And something to keep in mind, especially if you're thinking about podcast guest marketing or even starting a podcast, you may not have all those skills in place right now, but you can develop them. And that's one of the big aspects of the guide that I put together and everything I do with the trainings and coachings that I do is let's get you in a place to become optimized. Once you start doing interviews, you're going to get comfortable telling your brand story and getting your message out there. And the more you tell it, the more it becomes second nature and it starts to become more and more impactful as you progress. But don't be shying away from it because you feel like you're just not an effective communicator right now. You got to take time to develop that voice and develop that confidence. Once you do, man, sky is the limit.
And the beauty is when you get started doing this, you don't have an audience. There's no one to all you're doing is you're practicing. You're practicing and you're practicing. And, you know, here in the great state of Wisconsin, we love us some Vince Lombardi quotes. And one of the best ones is, practice doesn't make perfect. Perfect practice makes perfect. If you start a podcast as a host, or if you start going on podcasts as a guest, the more repetitions you get, a lot of people will call them at-bats to change the sports metaphor there. The more at-bats you take, the better your batting percentage is going to be. And, you know, longtime listeners of the Nonfiction Brand podcast will remember one of our favorite guests is George B. Thomas. And I asked him a question about his live streams or his videos I asked him a question about his videos that he does about HubSpot, the outgoing, or what do they call it? The outbound marketing, inbound. Oh, I don't know what it is. Anyway, he does a ton of videos about HubSpot. I asked him, so how many videos did you do before you heard something other than crickets in your audience? And he said, about 75. I'm like, seriously? And he said, no, that's great, because the first 50 were terrible. Then they started getting better. Then they started getting good. And right about the time they really were becoming solid, that's when my audience started showing up. And from there, the growth happened because he had built his confidence. He'd built his skills on camera and on a microphone so that when the audience was ready to find him, he was ready to give them something of value. That's what Jason Cercone's doing, man. I'm telling you, check out his Evolution of Brand podcast. Any place you get fine podcasts for free. His last name is spelled Cercone, Jason Cercone. I want to thank you again, Jason, for being on the Nonfiction Brand podcast. I want to give you an opportunity again to tell people where they can pick up that special guide.
DP, I really appreciate you having me on. I've been a big fan of your show, a huge fan of your book, and it's been great getting to connect with you personally, both on my show and now through your show. And I'm confident we'll keep this relationship going as we continue in our personal brand missions. But yeah, again, for all of the great listeners of Nonfiction Brand, visit jasoncercone.com/nonfiction brand, and you can get a free copy of 10 tips for becoming a valuable, fully optimized podcast guest. My gift to you. And if you're into the social media game, I do have my links there where we can connect. And I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation with everybody after you check out what's on that page.
Well, that's great, Jason. Thank you again for being on the podcast. I am, of course, your host, DP Knudten, and he is
Jason Circone.
And I'll be talking at y'all again next week. Bye-bye. Okay, now I'm going to do the outro to the live stream because I'm going to end this. It was great having Jason on. I hope you enjoyed it. And I hope you'll come back again for the next IMNSHOW. Until then, let's listen to the outro music, shall we?